McMill's bio. This is going to be your notes on types of cells. So as we get started, let's talk about a review of the topic. So as we've learned already, the idea of cell theory, or the idea that cells are in every single living thing, and a theory, as we learned, is an idea that is supported by evidence. So this is your idea of cells. So there were three tenets of cell theory that we talked about. The first was that living things are made of one or more cells. It could be a single cell organism or multicellular organism. We also learned that cells come from pre-existing cells. So cells just don't pop out of nowhere. They have to come from cells that already exist. And then lastly, number three is that a cell is the smallest unit of life, or as we could also say, the most basic unit of life, or the most basic living thing. Now that we know all of that, we know the three tenets of cell theory, we're going to start talking about types of cells. Now, there's going to be two different types of cells possible. There's what we call eukaryotes, or eukaryotic cells, but there's also another cell type called prokaryotic cells, or prokaryotes. Now, each of these are like their own umbrella, and then under that umbrella, we have these separate types of cells. So for eukaryotic cells, we could have plant, animal, or fungi cells, and for prokaryotic cells, we could have bacteria, or what we call archaea. So again, eukaryotic and prokaryotic are two umbrella terms, and then we have those subcategories underneath it. But what's the difference? Well, that's what these notes are going to be about. So we're going to start at the top here and talk about eukaryotic cells, or eukaryotes. So by definition, eukaryotes are cells that have what's called a nucleus and what we call membrane-bound organelles. So that word organelles might seem like a new term, and it is. If we break it down though, all it means is tiny organs. So you as a human have to have a heart, brain, lungs, all those organs that make our bodies work. Cells are pretty similar. They have to have their own version of organs, or tiny organs, in order to function properly. So eukaryotic cells have very specific types of organelles. One of these is a nucleus that has a specific function that we'll talk about in just a little bit, but it is a type of mini organ. Now, for examples, we have animal cells, plant cells, and fungal cells, or fungi. So think like a mushroom. Those are all types of eukaryotes. The features of eukaryotes is they tend to be larger and more complex cells. They have a nucleus, and that nucleus contains genetic material, or you might know it as DNA, which are the instructions that every living thing needs. They also have those membrane-bound organelles. As I said earlier, they have those tiny mini organs that they need to work. And eukaryotic cells can also undergo either sexual or asexual reproduction. So sexual meaning we need two parent cells, and asexual meaning you do not need a second parent cell. So that could be a cell pulling apart or reproducing with itself. Now, with eukaryotes, we have two subcategories that we're going to talk about, which are animal cells and plant cells. Now, starting with plant cells, they are slightly different, and the differences are due to the difference in their purpose and the different organelles, or mini organs, that they have. So for example, a plant cell will have what's called a cell wall, which is that outer layer that's holding all of that stuff inside. It gives us a really nice structure for our plant cell. It also has something that we call a chloroplast, which is a type of organelle. This is where photosynthesis happens. So you might have heard of that term before. We're going to learn about that more later, but plant cells are the only cells with a chloroplast. They also have another organelle that we call the large central vacuole that's located more towards the center of our plant cell. In contrast, the animal cell does not have a cell wall, so it has a membrane, which is still like an outer layer that keeps everything in, but it does not have that nice structured wall on the outside. There are no chloroplasts because animal cells can't do photosynthesis, and there are small or no vacuoles. As you can see, though, there are some similarities. They're still eukaryotes after all. So our animal cell and plant cell both have a nucleus, meaning we keep our DNA or our genetic material in that space. Additionally, each of the cells is also filled with this jelly-like fluid called cytoplasm. The cells aren't just empty space, they have like this jelly inside. We call this cytoplasm. And also, both of them have what we call a mitochondria, which you may have heard before is the powerhouse of the cell. It's where our cell gets its energy from, for the most part. So now you know about eukaryotes and the separate types, again, focusing on plant and animal cells. But what about prokaryotes? We said that there's two main categories of cells. Now let's talk about prokaryotes. So with prokaryotes, these are going to be cells that do not have a nucleus and do not have membrane-bound organelles. This might sound kind of funky. You're like, wait a second, didn't the nucleus hold all that genetic material or DNA? So where are the instructions? Well, they're still found in there. They're just not going to be found in our nucleus anymore. As you can see by our little graphic on the side, we don't have that nice circular structure of the nucleus now in the center, but we do have what looks like a string almost. This is representing our DNA. It's the fact that the DNA is not going to be in that nice tight-knit nucleus. It's going to be spread throughout our cell. Common examples of prokaryotes are going to be bacteria cells. Get to work. Probably not going to work for me, but let's go back over here. So, common examples of bacteria cells are, or sorry, prokaryotic cells are bacteria and archaea. Now, feature-wise, they are going to be different than our eukaryotes. They tend to be smaller and simpler. So if we're thinking our eukaryotes are large like this, our prokaryotes would probably be really, really, really small. They tend to be more simple because they don't have those membrane-bound organelles that are needed. Some of them have a cell wall. They may have what's called flagella or pili, which I'll explain in just a second. And they also can only undergo asexual reproduction or reproduction just by itself with an individual. If you look at the image on our left, you'll see that I have labeled the flagella and the pili. Flagella are a tail-like structure that some prokaryotes will have. That's for movement, kind of like a tail or almost like a fin on a fish. It's going to help it move around. And lastly, the pili for attachment. That's going to be these structures on the outside of some prokaryotes, not all of them, and that's what is used for attachment. So attaching to different surfaces and things. Because remember, prokaryotes tend to be single-celled organisms. So now that you know all of that, let's take a look at the comparison between the two. So we just said that there's these two separate umbrella terms, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and I just gave you a ton of information about all of their features. So let's put it in a nice Venn diagram so we can see just how different they really are. So in a Venn diagram, just quick review, we have the two separate circles, and then we have where those circles intersect. Where those circles intersect is where we have the similarities between the two topics, and on the outsides are where the differences are. So if in this case, our left circle is about eukaryotic cells, and our right circle is about prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus where prokaryotic cells don't. Eukaryotic cells have those membrane-bound organelles, whereas those prokaryotic cells do not. Eukaryotic cells tend to be larger and more complex, whereas our prokaryotic cells are smaller and simpler. Eukaryotic cells can undergo sexual or asexual reproduction, whereas prokaryotic cells only undergo sexual reproduction. But there are a few similarities. They are cells after all. They both contain DNA or the genetic material or instructions for the cell. They're just in different places. They both contain something called ribosomes, which we'll learn about in our next lesson. They also both have a cell membrane, so they have an outer layer, outer casing that holds everything inside the cell, whereas the eukaryotic cells and plant cells specifically might have a cell wall, and those prokaryotic cells, they all have the cell membrane. The cell wall is just an addition to that. And then lastly, cytoplasm. Both have to have cytoplasm or that jelly-like fluid that's going to be inside of the cell. So now that you know this, make sure you finish your notes and we will talk about this more later. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to add color to your notes.